From the news team at LinkedIn, I'm Jessi Hempel, and this is Hello Monday, a show about work on our own terms. A decade ago, a white supremacist walked into a church in Charleston, South Carolina, and he killed 9 Black parishioners. Now, in the aftermath of this horrible event, photos of the murderer circulated with Confederate flags and symbols. And we hit this moment where we as a culture and as a country were finally willing to consider the impact of our public symbols. Our monuments, our statues, the artistic representations of our history, and the way that they sanctioned violent, racist behavior. In South Carolina, they finally took the Confederate flag down from the State House. Across the country, officials began removing statues and monuments linked to racist ideologies. And this was a really big deal. As a culture, we finally began waking up to this idea that our art is not just our art. It's a snapshot of our history. And when we reevaluate it, we reckon with that history. And that is how we create a more just future. But this process has been tense. It has emboldened white supremacists. It's led all of us to grapple with our own backgrounds. And our guest today, he went on his own journey to confront America's past through its monuments. As you listen, no matter who you are, I hope you will keep in mind the questions that I am going to be asking myself. What stories do I tell myself about the past? Where have I learned them? What if there's more to those stories? More after this. Irvin Weathersby Jr. is a writing professor. His new book is In Open Contempt, Confronting White Supremacy in Art and Public Space. Irvin lives in Brooklyn. We first met when our kids started going to school together. But Irvin is from New Orleans. He grew up there. And in 2017, really just months before a statue's removal led to violence in Charlottesville, New Orleans removed 4 Confederate statues, including another one of Robert E. Lee. That's where this book begins. Here's Irvin.
I think the first thing that I wrote this book for was really a curiosity of mine, right? And really just thinking about, okay, well, how is this moment, this catalytic moment that happened in 2017 when these 4 monuments came down in my hometown? It's like, well, how is this moment, have the potential to kind of really foretell a future? I was really kind of giddy when it happened. I was like, wow, like the world is changing before my eyes. It kind of reminded me of the moment when Obama was elected. It was just like, wow, this is happening. This is going to happen in my lifetime. And as I was writing the book, I realized like, hey, like the past is all around us. It's all with us. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we look away, when we try to forget, or when we try to obscure the past, because it's a part of us. Like, I am nothing but all of my ancestors, all of the people who came before me, all of the stories that they've told me. And so as I approached this book, I really tried to think about what I was seeing in the present moment that was conjuring the past, to trying to think about like, well, how could we create a better life for ourselves?
And that present moment that you're talking about, and you talk about 2017, it is a moment when we are in a public way reconsidering history through the evaluation often of public monuments.
Yeah.
Help us understand that moment a little bit.
Well, I think it was a really charged moment. One, you had a lot of Black and brown people being murdered by police officers, right? Yeah. And in really vivid visual ways. And I think as a result of that, public leaders, the cultural kind of consensus, we're all asking ourselves, what is kind of creating these things? What is creating these things? And we had an incredibly horrific event happen in South Carolina when a white supremacist murdered a bunch of parishioners in a church.
Right.
And he was inspired by these monuments. He on record said that. And so I think it was a moment in our time where we're like, okay, these monuments were erected, during segregation, during Jim Crow, the Jim Crow era. And oftentimes I think we have just kind of overlooked them and forgotten that they were there.
Right.
But there's a number of white supremacists who haven't. There's a number of us, who look like men who haven't. And I think it was the moment that we were able to say, you know what? We now have the power. We now have the wherewithal. We have the understanding to change, to make changes in our lives. And again, we can go back to Obama. We can go back to all of these things that were happening that allowed us to kind of broaden our imagination to say, like, hey, we don't have to continue to be the same people that we were.
Right.
So.
Well, so you, in this book, you took us on a tour of our history through monuments that tell us things that we often are uncomfortable to contemplate about ourselves. You start the book in a moment of, I'm just going to call it like personal fear. I felt so terrified in the first 800 words of your story.
Yeah.
I wonder if you might, for our listeners, explain a little bit about how you start the book. And in particular, Irvin, what were you actually thinking as you, as you endeavored to do this?
When I told my family members what I had done, they all said the same thing. Like, what?
Right.
Like, are you crazy? Like, were you trying to get killed?
So it's 2017.
2017. I returned home specifically because this catalytic moment happened where the then mayor of New Orleans decided to take down 4 monuments, and it wasn't met without controversy. It was an incredible controversy in the city, and it was kind of tearing the city apart in many ways. And I'm a native New Orleanian, and I was here in Brooklyn, and I was observing from afar, and I was like, wow, I got to go back home. I got to go see this. I got to feel this. This is the moment in my lifetime that I won't ever forget. And so I really went home just to kind of say, you know what, let me revisit all of these kind of monuments that maybe I overlooked or hadn't thought about in depth. And I wanted to start with the former monument of Jefferson Davis. And when I returned to New Orleans at the time, it had already been removed. And just across the street from this monument, I pull up and, I know where it is. It's on Canal, and which is now not Jeff Davis. This is now Norman C. Francis Parkway.
It's been renamed.
It's been renamed since I wrote the book, which is also awesome in terms of the progress that has happened while I actually started writing it. So I go there, I'm looking for Jefferson Davis, and right across the street, there's these 3, I guess I got to call them white supremacists. They are surrounded by Confederate flags, MAGA flags, and they have these huge banners that basically say, hey, look, we are prioritizing a monument removal over the murder rate. And it was just really alarming, and I just couldn't ignore it. Like, I if I wanted to turn my back, I couldn't do it. And I think it's a perfect metaphor for the book. I couldn't look away. And so I said, you know what? I'm going to go over there and figure out why they're there.
So they're surrounding a monument.
Yeah.
They have obvious paraphernalia that identifies them as MAGA supporters.
Yep.
They are essentially advertising themselves as in favor of preserving the monument. You are a person by yourself.
Yep.
In the body that I occupy in the world, I would not cross the street without incredible trepidation.
Yeah.
You approached them.
Yeah.
And,
we strike up a conversation. I'm there, and I'm really trying to steel myself, and I say, hey, why are you guys here? Like, what is this really about? Like, what is this spectacle about? And we begin to have this conversation about the origins of slavery. And to their chagrin, maybe they didn't know I knew, what slavery was about and how we got here. But at the end of the conversation, in a way, I think I left victorious in a way. I was able to tell them, like, hey, like, what you guys are supporting is ridiculous. It's racist, and, it's not what this country is about.
Yeah.
And so we had a really charged exchange in ways in which I think they left surprised, I left surprised, and I continued on. I kept walking along this strip of New Orleans that I guess you can call it a gallery of monuments.
So what I really loved about that story is that you made room for the surprise on both your part and their part. And that felt to me like a true and honest exchange between humans.
Yeah.
And particularly in the moment that we are in,
Yeah.
where everything feels large and politicized and charged.
Yeah.
It feels to me like meeting the moment means figuring out how to talk to each other again as humans.
Yeah, I truly believe that. I think that moment kind of sets up the book and all of the exchanges I have, because I truly believe in humans and I believe everyone is redeemable. And, I truly believe that racism is a psychosis. It's not necessarily something that you're born with, right? And until we start to really engage with each other and really kind of, hear each other's stories, will we start to kind of have a perspective shift of who we are and, how do we get here and how do we coexist? How do we live together?
Well, so much of your book is stories, and in many moments, stories that caught me by surprise or caused me to rethink of, just for example, the monuments in South Dakota on the side of the mountain.
Yeah.
To just think about them newly. And at first, I wanted to jump to, okay, so what do I do? But as I continued to read, I realized, no, maybe the point right now is to be willing to consider them newly.
My great-grandmother was a wonderful woman, really impassioned woman who lived through Jim Crow and suffered through some incredible traumas. But she often would tell me these stories, and one of these stories was that her grandmother was a Cherokee Indian. And the last time we spoke, she was kind of telling me her life story in ways that I hadn't realized. And for some reason, I harped on the idea of her grandmother and trying to understand that story. And that ties into Jackson Square, which is probably the most iconic image of New Orleans, where Andrew Jackson is astride a horse in the middle of our city. And that's kind of in our logo. It's everywhere, right? It's another one of those symbols and monuments that people don't consider. And so when I was thinking about that moment, talking to my grandmother in New Orleans, kind of trying to understand what these things mean, I realized, like, hey, I probably need to go to Native country to kind of see how they feel about their removal, right? And so I arrive in South Dakota and I go to a reservation. And one moment that I have that I think that you're speaking about is when I go to Mount Rushmore and I'm talking to the chief educator of interpretation, which is incredible. It's an incredible title and job. And as I'm there, hearing these stories and learning all of these things that I'm learning from the Crazy Horse Memorial and the reservation and all these artists, I start to get a different sense about Native life. I never, at least knowingly, engage with Natives or indigenous people here in America. And I go there and I have this really different experience where I'm able to kind of take a step back and realize like how much America has injured, indigenous populations.
So, Irvin, how does that tie back to your great-grandmother?
The idea was simply, she told me, look, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of taking control of your life, right? I think that was one of the biggest themes that I left from her. But because she, had told me that she was Native, I went there seeking kinship.
Yeah.
I went there seeking kind of some sort of community. They say, hey, look, I am no different from you, right? And I think in a way, if we can, make that bridge,
right,
cross that bridge for everyone, like we are actually more related than we're not, we're actually more similar than we're not, then we could actually engage with people. And I had this intense or at least comical, briefly for me, moment where I told a Native person there, hey, I'm also, Native. I have, Native ancestry. And he looked at me. He was like, yeah, that's kind of offensive. But let me tell you why. And he, proceeded to tell me, hey, look, it's not about, ancestry or, community or kinship in that way. It's really about what are you going to do for Native people, right?
Mm-hmm.
How are you going to create some sort of impact and change? And in a way, I hope this book does that. I mean, I went there really seeking, trying to understand Native art, Native people, Native life. And I came away from this incredible, palpable sense that their injuries or their trauma is still so present.
Right. So it's not about seeking shared identity of oppression. It's about being willing to learn about all the pieces of your identity that you don't share.
Yeah. I absolutely agree. That reminds me of a book by Kathy Park Hong.
Yeah.
It's called Minor Feelings.
Uh-huh.
It's an incredible book about essays. And one of those essays that really moved me, I've taught it many times, is she speaks about this idea of speaking nearby a culture. Right. I think sometimes we have this fear that, hey, if I'm not above that, if I'm not of that culture or I'm not in that community, I can't talk about that community or I can't kind of engage with it. And that's actually false. Right. I mean, the idea is that we should figure out ways in which we can talk about our cultures together. I mean, because in a way they often overlap. Right. We're all humans. And so how can we see commonalities more so than differences? And so, yes, that was what it was. Like, I mean, that lesson for me, in South Dakota was to be able to kind of see how our lives are similar and how white supremacy really has shaped both of our communities.
We're going to take a quick break here. We'll be back with more from Irvin after this. And we're back with Irvin Weathersby Jr. A lot of the time, people who look like me, we just want what I call the list of 5 things. What's the quick SparkNotes version of undoing racism and combating injustice? Like, I'm in, but can you make it convenient for me? Irvin's book invites us to slow down and engage with the communities that we want to support. Engage with the people, the art, and most importantly, their stories. Irvin was careful and deliberate about the stories he told in his book, and for very good reason. Here, once more, is Irvin Weathersby Jr.
There's a moment in the book, my editor and I went back and forth about what to include, what not to include. And I was really kind of like pounding the table, like, look, I want to include this story about my grandmother. I want to include this letter. And I think I made a good decision to kind of listen to him and say, you know what, this might be too much. This takes away from your voice. But I'm going to try not to get emotional here. But everything I write is really about my grandmother, not my great-grandmother, her daughter. And there's a story in there where when they're being evacuated from Hurricane Katrina, my grandmother very early on recognized my potential, just my advanced aptitude, and she just started feeding me books and words and everything. And we just had an incredible relationship, just a literary relationship, that really kind of went beyond the bounds of like our kind of working class kind of existence. And I was really fortunate. And I say all that to say that she often gave me her words, gave me her time. And one exchange that, is in the book, that is mentioned in the book, is she detailed the experience of being evacuated from Hurricane Katrina. And, some of your listeners may remember, some of your listeners may not. But, in 2005, obviously Hurricane Katrina really destroyed our city. 80% of the city was underwater. And some of the images that were coming out of our city were just incredible, where people were going to the Superdome or being left on overpasses and just really kind of dealing with incredible circumstances of trying to survive. And my grandmother and my family kind of went through that firsthand. And she, the wonderful woman that she was, wrote about it. And she detailed in really almost like a very meticulous kind of, documentarian type of way, her experience, every day from being evacuated to, eventually finding shelter and support. And so I say all that to say that I think she was my first teacher in really validating what it means to kind of tell your own story, to really what that would do for others. I think that's one short answer. There's another answer if we have time for it. But the book, the title comes from a Frederick Douglass quote. Yeah, and Frederick Douglass, of all writers, he's also up there on my list, really had the incredible kind of fortune to write about his life multiple times in multiple, memoirs or autobiographies. And I think his example is really, speaks to the kind of Black American experience, right? When he was writing about his life, writing about slavery, writing about the horrors of slavery, so that Americans can kind of say, hey, maybe we need to reconsider what this thing is and what we've tied ourselves to. And his books outsold everything.
Right.
at the time. He was like a celebrity in that way, but his books weren't about capitalism. It was about getting us free. And so I think that's really, in terms of the literary tradition, the Black American literary tradition is really about documenting our lives.
It leads me actually to want to ask like a sort of contemporary question, right?
Yeah.
Which is, you start this book in 2017, the world looks one way.
Mm-hmm.
I remember 2017. It was right the year before my son was born.
Mm-hmm.
My wife and I were about to get married. It felt like the world was opening in every way. And
Mm-hmm.
politics were a little questionable, but it felt to me like the world was opening.
Mm-hmm.
You fast forward to the moment that we're in,
Mm-hmm.
and it feels very different.
Yeah.
Very, very different. And in particular, I think about, I work in corporate America.
Mm-hmm.
Like there is so much pressure on DEI
Mm-hmm.
and diversity programs. You're seeing companies, I think just this week, Walmart announced a rollback of some of its DEI programs.
Yeah.
What is the consequence of choosing not to confront within our own institutions? This is through the lens of business, but really broadly our institutions, this history.
Yeah, because I think not just business, schools, admission policies, I think all of these things are being reconsidered based on who's in power, right? I think it's a failure of humanity in the sense that what we are going to do if we decide to silo ourselves and say that we are this homogenous, kind of culture or country or populace, is we're going to lose the evolutionary process of humanity. There's an incredible book that I love called Exit West by Mohsin Hamad. And he's a Pakistani author, and I love his work, and it's fiction. But it's this notion that the world migration is going to happen everywhere in the world, not necessarily just by climate change, but just by movement. Everywhere people are going to move. And in a way, that's kind of how America was founded. People decided to move from one continent to the next. And that's also a part of the human experience. And once we move and we share cultures, then we start to kind of become more like each other. We start to kind of see each other. But when we talk about rolling back DEI, I think it's really one of those moments where we're trying to consciously say that we're not going to think about other people who are not like us.
Yeah.
Right. And if we do that, it's really a fool's errand to think that we're going to arrive somewhere better. Right. This whole notion that we're going to make America great again. Really, if we're talking about that era, that is when we had a civil war. That is the moment when people say, you know what, you believe this, I believe this, we're going to fracture. And I think we're at that moment. I think we're at a moment that we're going to experience another fracture. I'm not so pessimistic to say that people like me and other marginalized groups are going to stop fighting, because what's going to happen, the world is changing, right? We are going to continue to grow in numbers. We're going to continue to align, and the powers that be are going to lose eventually. And I think they recognize that. And I get it. I get it. You don't want to kind of give up everything that you stole.
Is white supremacy something that we have the potential ever to fully confront in our culture? Or is that a pipe dream?
Well, look, I'm going to say yes, because I live in the land of hope and optimism, and not blindly. Like, we still have to work for it, right? But look, if we just look at the scales, the levers, right? White supremacy has been around for about 6 centuries or so, right? In America, freedom for people like me has only been around for like 60 some odd years or so, right? And so clearly we have a lot to combat, right? There's a lot of, white supremacy. I think another thing that this book shows us is that it's everywhere. It's not just in, corporate America, it's in our schools, it's in our banks, it's in really, media, television, everything. It's really ingrained in this idea subconsciously. But I think one of the biggest shifts that we can potentially figure out, like how we can kind of get towards there, closer at least, is to remember that white supremacy is not just about white people. Right. That's not the thing. It's not about people per se, actually. It's about institutions that we all subscribe to, whether consciously or subconsciously. Right. It's about these systems that create power levers, right, and oppression. And, people like me could also be agents of white supremacy, right?
Right.
We can injure ourselves, whether consciously or unconsciously, right?
Right.
When we subscribe to certain beliefs that are not actually in our benefit, but these, stem from white supremacy, whether it's, this idea of capitalism or working, until
Right.
we, are dead, or working, incredible hours a week for some greater good that doesn't really exist, right?
I think that might be one of the most important things to consider
Yeah.
when interacting with your work or interacting with the larger idea. I think so often we rush to figure out who the bad dudes are and to affiliate with the good dudes. It's a very binary system, and it's a very people-based system. When if you stop to envision this instead, as you referred to it earlier as a psychosis, and I was like, that as an infection that exists within the systems we live.
Yeah.
Then you have to reckon with the fact that no matter the color of your skin or the gender in which you identify, you are reproducing these systems with every breath, with every movement, with every choice that you consciously and subconsciously make. You have a different kind of conversation, and you have a different kind of empathy toward each other.
Yeah. I think we don't have to point the finger so much at each other and recognize, hey, look, we're all kind of guilty of this. Like, I was taught this as well. I was taught to think less of myself,
Yeah.
And other people have taught me that too, right? And you were taught to think more of yourself, and that's not necessarily right either, right? And so how can we investigate these systems? And I think, there's a chapter in this book where I kind of drill down on my education, right? And thinking about, how do I learn certain things and how do I teach certain things? And that chapter ends with a real practical, assignment. Like, I want people to take a step back, sit with this, and ask themselves, like, how am I actually participating in white supremacy? There's many places in the world where things are moving backwards, right? There's a retrenchment of sorts, but I think it takes, one person to tell another, and then we have a groundswell. We have a movement. And I think the history of the world tells us that this could happen again.
It strikes me, we began by talking about monuments and art, and we progressed to talk about the human experience, which is exactly what your book does.
Yeah.
What is the connection of art to the human experience? Why talk about art in the first place when you talk about these issues?
That's a really great question, because I think, some people are going to read this book and be like, well, this guy's not even an art historian. Like, what gives him the kind of courage or the license to kind of talk about art in the ways in which he thinks he can? And I think the book is really trying to encourage you to believe that you can. Like, we created art. We are all products of art. I think art is one of the first expressions that we've have of our existence, right? That with language, with actual, words, and language is not all just words, but art is a way in which we communicate, and it's a part of the human experience.
Right.
And as a result of that, what we create and what we consume really defines who we become.
That was Irvin Weathersby Jr., the author of In Open Contempt, Confronting White Supremacy in Art and Public Space. Find it wherever you buy books. The audiobook is especially good, so really you should check it out. I'm so grateful to Irvin for sharing this book with the world and for coming into the studio and sharing it with us. In Open Contempt makes the strong case for empathy at a time where we need it most. So much of what we spoke about today boils down to consideration. How do we consider each other? Curiosity and understanding sit at the heart of Irvin's ethos, and they play such a critical role in combating white supremacy. Irvin challenges us not to feel we must be an expert in order to express our curiosity. We can and should challenge the things we see and experience every day. We're going to talk a lot more about this week at office hours. I really hope you'll join. We're going to go live on Wednesday afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern, just as we always do. You can find the link to join us in the show notes. Hope to see you there. Hello Monday is a production of LinkedIn News. Lolia Briggs produced this episode with help from Rachel Karp. Sarah Storm is our senior producer. Our theme music was composed just for us by the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder. Sound design, engineering, and additional music by Asaf Gudron. Michaela Greer is a constant friend. Thank you to LinkedIn's editorial associates, Ali McPherson and Alexandra Kuznetsova. Enrique Montalvo is our executive producer. Dave Pond is head of production and creative operations. Courtney Coop is head of original programming. Dan Roth is the editor-in-chief of LinkedIn. I'm Jessi Hempel. We're back next Monday. Thanks for listening.